Welcome to Class Matters, the podcast where we ask the question, what would our country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? Class Matters is a project of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute. I'm Catherine Isaac, Executive Director. Inflation and the fight against it is on the public agenda today in a way not seen since the 1970s. In episode 9, Professor Adolph Reed Jr. leads a discussion with Sam Gindin and Samir Sonti on what inflation means for the working class and why anti-inflation policies have often come at the expense of workers. We'll also look at how this round of inflation is different, how we should fight it, and what inflation means for bargaining union contracts. Welcome to Class Matters. Let's start with introductions. Adolph Reed Jr. has been involved in working class politics for more than half a century. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include American and Afro-American politics and political thought, urban politics, and American political development. He serves on the board of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute and is the author of several books, most recently The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. Sam Gindin was research director of the Canadian Auto Workers from 1974 to 2000. He is co-author with Leo Panitch of The Making of Global Capitalism. Samir Sonti has worked as a political organizer for the Pennsylvania Association of Staff, Nurses, and Allied Professionals, and as a researcher for Unite Here, which represents hospitality workers in the US and Canada. He teaches at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies. Welcome to the three of you, and Adolph, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. Well, Sam and Samir, welcome to Class Matters, and thanks for joining us to discuss the vitally important but often vague and poorly understood topic of inflation. So let's start out with some basics. At the most basic level, inflation is a decline in a currency's purchasing power over time, so that, for instance, a dollar will buy less. Am I correct that, especially in a dynamic economy, inflation will happen over time as a matter of course? For example, in 1950, a bottle of Coca-Cola cost 6 cents. In 2022, it costs 80 cents. And if that is the case, under what conditions does or should, and I guess those are two distinct questions, inflation become a cause for concern for the economy as a whole? And as a follow-up, is the inflation we're experiencing now out of the ordinary?
Well, I think this is a great place to start, just to kind of get this definition out on the table. Everyone, I think, is well aware that prices increase year after year. That's been the case for a long time, and you see it in basically everything that you buy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's in fact a good thing. Prices rising a little bit each year is a sign that the economy is generally doing okay, that people and businesses and all kinds of economic actors are optimistic about what's to come. And as long as it's happening in a stable and predictable way, it enables reasonable planning about the future. Where it becomes, and actually this is maybe another way to think about it, is the opposite scenario in which prices were falling, which we would call deflation. And deflation is a really bad thing. It is a sign of economic contraction. And, the last time we saw a serious deflationary crisis was the Great Depression. That's obviously not something we want to repeat. So a little bit of inflation that's predictable is not a problem, especially given, as long as wages keep up with the rising prices. But where it becomes a problem is when prices start rising in an unpredictable way, month after month, year after year. That then complicates all kinds of considerations about the future. It makes it very difficult to anticipate what the world's going to look like a little bit down the road. And that makes all kinds of economic planning more challenging. So that's what we might call inflation proper, a generalized increase in prices across the board. That's and it's becoming a problem. That proper inflation is becoming a problem when it starts to get out of control and occurs in an unpredictable way. What we've seen over the last year or so is something more like the latter. Prices have been rising in a way that no one was anticipating, and it has started to complicate people's lives. Working peoples have seen, their real wages, right, which is their wages adjusted for inflation, fall over the last year, even though their actual paycheck may be increasing. That's a problem, right? So now we've got a situation in which this has started to get a little bit out of control and beyond the predictable and stable way. And so I guess that's when the ordinary routine kind of inflation that we're all used to turns into more of an issue. Sam, I don't know if you want to add to that.
The main thing I wanted to add to what Samir is saying is that this kind of inflation is actually very unique. It's not just that it's, after about 40 years of fairly stable inflation at a low level, that we suddenly have so much of inflation compressed into a short period. It's also the nature of this crisis. This crisis begins with an event that's basically external, COVID. There's a health crisis, and the state is itself stopping the economy. This isn't the question of the economy just stopping. The state is interfering in order to end this health crisis, to stop the economy, but also to set the stage for reproducing it later on, which means that you have to support small business. You have to support people either because they're going to riot otherwise, or because you're trying to reproduce a labor force. So you've got this COVID problem. And along with the COVID problem is all the lockdowns as part of the solution, which means interruptions and therefore short supply. And short supply has a particular impact on inflation, because the question is, how do you allocate the short supply? And again, in a capitalist economy, it's going to be allocated by raising prices, and whoever can afford it gets it. So there's a distributional problem. So I think where this starts taking us, when you see the specifics of this inflation, is two things. One is, well, if it's just because of COVID and all the expenditures under COVID for health and drugs and for supporting people, that more was spent than was being produced, then that sounds temporary. How do we go from this temporary thing, not just waiting it out, to declaring an emergency is one question. And the other point is, you begin to frame the question differently. It's not just a question of inflation. It's actually a question of class distribution and who pays. And so just on the first thing, and just very quickly, this is a short-term phenomenon in one sense. But what's scaring capital, and especially the Federal Reserve, is that even though workers haven't caused this, no one can really make any kind of a credible case to say that workers caused this. In trying to deal with it, their problem is that even if workers are getting 5% increases and falling behind inflation, which is running at 8.5%, if 5% gets locked in, not only will there be a lot of conflict and tensions, but if 5% gets locked in, then inflation might stay at 5%. And with the uncertainty, people will be guessing what it'll be, and there'll be more conflict. So they're anticipating a working class response to this. If workers would just accept it, they could say, okay, let's wait it through. Prices will fall. But they're anticipating that this is actually opening the door to conflicts over distribution. And that's what's worrying them. So what we're going to see is that even if the strategy of raising interest rates doesn't lower inflation, they'll just bump it up. They're going to deal with inflation. I mean, if what they've done so far doesn't break inflation, they'll go further, and they'll risk deep recession, as Volcker did. The 70s were very completely different, but still, they are determined that they have to break the expectation of people trying to catch up. And this is really going to apply very much to labor, because labor is still, the most important cost in production. So it raises some really complex questions.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, both of you guys. And that's great, because among other things, like, it underscores the extent to which, and this is a question I'm going to come back to a little later, but the extent to which inflation is actually a screen or a subterfuge or a euphemism for deeper political conflicts. But I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. But I want you guys to respond now to, like, when we talk about concern, and you both have kind of hit on this in a way, the related question about inflation is, for whom is it a concern? I mean, obviously, it doesn't affect everyone the same way. And we know, for example, that the investor class and the working class are affected differently by inflation. Can you each elaborate a bit on how inflation, or different kinds of inflation, might affect different segments of the population differently? Because I think that would be helpful for our listeners to think about as well.
And that's something that we have to address, which we'll get into in a second. And it also affects the working class very unevenly. You can't just tell workers to increase their wages to keep up with inflation, because they don't have the strength to do that right now, obviously. But it also affects workers so unevenly. The workers who might keep up with inflation would be a minority. Most workers won't. And the workers who are weaker will really get hammered. And this is dangerous, because it divides the working class. That's another thing that we don't talk as much about. For capital, the problem is instability, and then that it leads to conflict over who's going to pay for this. But there's also this division in the working class. And the danger is that workers who are really getting hammered will resent those few workers who are keeping up with inflation, if that happens. And they'll be mobilized by capital, by the right, to blame those workers for the inflation. So we have to be conscious of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, as Sam was alluding to in the previous remark, inflation has very different effects on working people, on investors, and also within the working class. Different groups within the working class, more well-organized, less well-organized groups, feel the burden of inflation in different ways. But even setting that aside for a second, I think this question gets at one of the other tricky issues with defining inflation. Inflation, as we're talking about it now, and it's as it's characterized in the news and so on, is this generalized increase in prices. And specifically what that refers to is a statistical index that measures all prices across the entire economy and applies different weights to different kinds of things. And, one example of that is a consumer price index, which is a term, you'll start to notice if you read about this. CPI appears again and again and again. That has been rising at the highest rate in 40 years over the last few months. But for working people, even before the CPI started rising, a lot of costs were increasing for a long time. Like housing, for instance, has, of course, been getting more and more expensive for years. And especially for renters who feel that each year they see their rent go up. They've been dealing with a particular kind of inflation that takes up a good chunk of their income. But that wasn't a problem in the eyes of everyone who talks about this for a living, right? That wasn't a problem as long as it's confined to renters, as long as housing prices don't spread into everything else. It's once everything starts raising that inflation suddenly becomes a problem. Housing inflation is not a problem. Generalized inflation is a problem. Another kind of angle on this is financial assets. Over the last decade, we've seen Wall Street boom, right? Stock prices have been rising. Cryptocurrency, this novel thing, booming, right? This is a particular kind of inflation too. We might call it asset inflation or financial asset inflation. And it has its own set of causes. And Wall Street and the investor class, they're not terribly concerned about that, right? They actually love seeing asset inflation because it fattens their profit margins. And one of the assets that's been appreciating in price has been real estate, which figures back into the housing price inflation and affects working people. So already we see asset inflation benefits Wall Street on the one hand, but insofar as it affects housing prices, it then harms working people. None of this bothered any, mainstream economic commentators, any Wall Street bankers until it became generalized price inflation. And the reason that suddenly there's such concern about it is, on the one hand, a concern about instability and the expectation of future inflation and what that means for business planning and so on, as we've both alluded to. But on the other hand, it's what Sam was just referring to, is the fear that this generalized inflation persisting at the rate it's been going is going to embolden workers to demand more and get more. And that is the underlying class tension that's at play and why this has become so important. So, suddenly the fact that all these investors are worried about inflation says something, right? For working people, the cost of living has been a problem for a long time. And there's a distinction here to draw between the cost of living and inflation.
Great, thanks. Sam, do you have anything to
add? I mean, a few things. I mean, one of the things that makes this so difficult, I think that what Samir is saying is absolutely right, except we also have to be sensitive to the fact that there are workers who want to see the housing prices rise because it's the only asset they actually have to pass on or for their pension. So we have this, another dimension of the potential divisions in the working class that we have to keep remembering. A lot of the discussion sounds as if we're all in this together. It's a technical problem. Let's fix inflation. And the problem we have to keep getting back to is, well, where we were wasn't very good. It wasn't very, it was, as Samir was saying. So from that perspective, it begins to be a question of, how do you also use this crisis and everybody talking about it to raise these larger questions? The only other thing I just want to emphasize, just so it's clear, if workers are successful in raising their wages, what worries the capitalist class, but what worries everybody, because capitalism depends on business wanting to invest, is that if workers did really well, you might squeeze profits. Now, it's exaggerated because profits have grown so much over the last 40 years that there's all kinds of space to take some of it back without threatening profits. Profits are not low, they're not in danger, but there is this concern always that if workers get more, then that could squeeze our profits unless we're able to raise prices. The thing I really want to emphasize is we have to move away from seeing inflation as a sudden technical problem that needs a technical fix. It's a political problem that should raise all kinds of questions about what kind of a society we are, who's going to pay for this, what are our priorities. So all these questions are being posed. What we have to do is make it into a clear political issue about the nature of capitalism, about democracy, about equality, about distribution, and about priorities. So maybe I'm undercutting where you were trying to get to.
No. I'm still going to get there, but there's another step along the way. And like, this is the perfect segue. So would you elaborate on how different approaches to fighting inflation affect different segments of the population? And what would be examples of some working class approaches to fighting or preventing inflation?
Do you want me to get in, Samir? Or
Yeah.
do you want...
Sure, jump in.
Okay. Yeah. And, I mean, the normal response is to tell workers that they should keep up with inflation and encourage their militancy, and that's fine. But you can't suddenly magically give workers the power to do that. The reality is most of the working class, if it's getting its wages up to 5 or 6%, it's a cut.
Right.
But even to get there would take a lot of militancy, and it's going to get harder as the government responds. So that's an inadequate response. There is a sense in which militancy in itself isn't enough because you can't build it very quickly. But also the response has to be more political and ideological. So, for example, if the issue is that COVID was an emergency and one way or the other we have to pay for it, and that means sacrifice, well, the obvious answer is, why aren't the people who are rich sacrificed?
Right.
Why don't we put an emergency wealth tax on and say there was an emergency? You had more benefits than everybody else, and the rich are getting a lot more. That might be acceptable to a lot of people if they're not sacrificing a lot. But once you start asking people to make big sacrifices, it raises the question of equality. So I think there's a whole bunch of things to think about. And, the distribution question is obviously crucial. We can't just print money. We have to take it from the rich in one way or the other. And the corporations. We have to talk about price controls, but we have to be careful. Price controls have always come with wage controls.
Right.
And the difference is that wages are easier to control because the corporations will do it for you. Price controls requires a lot of organization. I mean, you'd have to get, everybody in a community organized to be checking prices all the time. And they don't have all access to all the information about costs, not even the state does. So wage and price controls are difficult. And again, we have to keep coming back to it's a capitalist economy. And if you screw up wages and price formation, you're going to have other problems if you don't have an alternative. And that means we have to really radically address distribution and start talking about structural changes in the economy and about power. So the corporations don't have that kind of power to blackmail us, basically. And that means investigating a lot of things we've kind of taken off the table about public ownership, about rationing. I mean, if we're going to have some kind of a transition for a while, we're going to have to cut back seriously on oil. Well, who's going to get it? Is the market, or are we actually going to say we're going to ration it in some way, as we did in wartime? So we have to start these discussions we haven't had, and they all take us away from just inflation to what kind of a society we have. And I'm worried that if we don't see it as that kind of an opportunity, we either get trapped into technical fixes for inflation, just so we can get back to the old status quo, or ignoring inflation, in which case the working class will walk over us, or worse, frustrations just keep growing and the right takes advantage of it.
Yeah. How about you, Samir?
I mean, building on everything Sam has said, when we're talking about inflation, the abstract nature of the issue can make it really difficult to get our arms around. But when we get into the policy responses to it, it becomes a little bit more comprehensible. Mm-hmm. And so thus far, and for the last 40 years, the principal response to inflation has come from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is this institution that most people have probably heard about, but that is rarely explained in terms of how it functions. And what it is, it's the central bank of the United States. And what that means is that it's essentially the top of the financial system. It is the bank for all the bankers. And practically speaking, what that means is it controls interest rates. And by raising interest rates, the Federal Reserve intends to slow down economic activity. And by slowing down economic activity, they intend to increase unemployment. By increasing unemployment, they intend to put downward pressure on wages. The reasoning there is that, as Sam was saying, there's a fear that wages are the driver of inflation or going to be the driver of inflation. And the underlying cause of higher wages, which is workers with some bargaining power, needs to be addressed. And that's addressed through poor economic conditions, higher unemployment. That's what higher interest rates are intended to accomplish. And that's what we've been seeing over the last few months. And that's what we're likely to continue seeing. And that's not a secret, right? They're very, very candid about the fact that that's the objective here. When we clearly don't want that, right? We clearly don't want to have inflation managed through more unemployment. That's not a solution that works for working people. But as Sam says, we also can't ignore that this is a problem and have no solution of our own. And this is where we start getting into everything that Sam is talking about, the bigger picture questions about capitalism and the shape of our society. If we, let's say, try to implement price controls on a variety of things. It's a very complex thing to do, right? As Sam mentioned, during World War II, there was price controls on basically every good for sale in the economy. It took a staff of 100,000 federal employees. It took massive participation from communities all over the country to enforce. And it came with wage controls. And as Sam said, wage controls are easier to enforce because corporations have a lot of power over that. But let's just say we were hypothetically able to implement this. Ultimately, if we were able to implement it in a way that was fair to workers, which said, all right, wages ought to rise and prices ought to be controlled, we do encounter the likelihood that we will squeeze profits.
Right.
And if we are squeezing profits, we do encounter the likelihood that businesses will say, well, we don't have anything to invest with. And investment is what creates jobs. And so that's, we can kind of wag our finger at that, but there's some legitimacy to that contention, right? That if profits are squeezed, the pool from which investment could theoretically occur shrinks.
Right.
And so on the one hand, we could just say, oh, well, I guess we can't control profits. We can't limit prices while allowing wages to rise. And then we're back to where we started and the Federal Reserve's response is what it is. Or we could say, all right, well, maybe we have to limit profits. And maybe we have to figure out another way of mobilizing investment to create jobs. And that raises big questions about what our society looks like. What does that mean for the public, this public sector, the state, to say, well, we got to figure out what needs investment. We got to figure out how we're going to move the investment there. We got to figure out how we're going to get the funds, not just printing money, but actually taxing appropriately to marshal that revenue to pay for this stuff. How are we going to do that? And these are the big questions that ultimately this issue raises. So we don't want the Federal Reserve to slam its fist down on inflation and take it out on workers through higher unemployment. We don't want inflation to persist. So we need an alternative, and that alternative necessarily requires thinking about how the economy is organized and the role of the government in organizing the economy and not surrendering the most important functions, which is principally the function of investment, right? The movement of capital towards specific ends, to private interests alone. Private interests ought not have a total monopoly on that decision because that decision affects all of us. And this then is a big political question that clearly involves class and class power and struggle and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a couple of things Samir said because they're important to maybe go over again. The Federal Reserve, essentially the central bank, is in the news all the time because they're doing this. And they're doing it not because Biden is telling them to do it, but because they're trying to make a capitalist economy function. But what's important about what Samir was raising is the Federal Reserve is given a certain autonomy. It doesn't come back to Parliament and debate these things. And that makes it seem like it's just a technical issue. We've just got experts deciding what the economy really needs. And it kind of evolved because making decisions through the Federal Reserve was a way of protecting tough decisions from democracy.
Right. That's right.
Whereas if it was fiscal policy, you'd be debating taxes and you'd be debating what you spend it on. So some people are arguing, well, we need to depend more on fiscal policy. You can't just depend on monetary policy. Mm-hmm. That's true. But the reality is that unless you're also strong, all that fiscal policy is going to do is say, well, we have to spend less.
Right. That's
and
right.
we can't tax because the corporations will not like that and they might not invest. So we can't get out of the politics of it. But it does begin to suggest that, hey, choices are polarized. There's actually no nice middle ground where we just fix inflation and then everything's fine. Even Powell, when he announces his policies, he says, look, I don't want to cause unemployment. But what he also says is, but I will if I have to, because if that's what it takes, we have to do it. I don't have a choice either. And as long as you think in terms of that constrained box, this is a message to all of us, workers, everybody, you can't get out of that box.
Right. That's right.
There's a system with a logic and power to it. And unless that gets on the table, we can't fix this.
Well, I have one other question that's really deeply inside the box, and it's a very practical issue, which is what inflation and the possibility of government-provoked recession as the response to inflation means for unions trying to negotiate contracts. And I know, Samir, you've recently written about this, but how do you think unions should or can respond in a moment like the one that we're in now, when talk about inflation, even though it seems to have died down a bit recently, has the Fed threatening to provoke a recession to cool down the economy, supposedly to curtail inflation? How do you think this situation could or ought to affect bargaining strategies?
Yeah, this is really, I think, one of the most important questions, because when we start talking about this issue, we necessarily get to a pretty high level. We're talking about the economy as a whole and how we're going to manage the economy as a whole. And that's where we need to go, right? There's no question that that's where we need to go and that this is a political issue. But we're not going to get there tomorrow or next month. And workers have to live through tomorrow and next month, and unions have to navigate the reality of the present. And this is a real dilemma of how to manage this. And there's no, this is what we might call a contradiction of capitalism, right? There's no easy answer to it.
And of workers.
And for sure, yeah, exactly. And of workers. But I would say the short way of thinking about it, I think, is, again, starting from what's been happening. The Federal Reserve is reacting the way they're reacting. They are raising interest rates. We don't currently have the power to implement the more comprehensive type of reforms that we think we need to address this. And so what we're staring at is either the likelihood of somewhat consistent inflation, or more likely, as insofar as inflation continues, a more and more harsh response from the Federal Reserve. What all that amounts to is the likelihood at some point of a recession. And so if you're going into bargaining right now, these are the conditions that you've got to be surveying, right? What we know is that corporations across the board have had one of the greatest runs in history. Profits have been through the roof over the last year. Profits have been through the roof over the last decade. So corporations, as Sam said, have plenty of profit to give. And what we know is, as long as this issue remains, we stare at least the likelihood, if not the certainty, of some kind of downturn in the future. And I think what those two things add up to is that if you're bargaining, you got to go for everything you can get right now, because the conditions may not remain as favorable for such a struggle. Now, that in and of itself raises the larger political question, right? I mean, the entire labor movement going for what we can get and locking in certain level of wage increases. What does this mean for how inflation persists? What does that mean for how the Federal Reserve continues to think about it? And so, eventually that gets us back to the political issue. And so we can't lose sight of that. We necessarily need to keep that in mind, but we kind of have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Right? We have to maintain the political sensibility while being practical. And the fact of the matter is the conditions are favorable for a real struggle right now for more. And Sam's thought a lot about this, about the sort of the implications of this kind of militancy, and I'm sure has a lot to add. But I would just say both are necessary, and right now is a good time to be bargaining, and it may not be a good time 12 or 18 months from now.
Sam?
I think, first of all, what's really important is what Samir said about the space. There is space to win things right now, and that you can defend. The profits are high, and workers asking for more should be articulated as, we're really trying to redistribute wealth, and who pays for this? And capital has had a free run for an awfully long time, and workers are way behind, and we're trying to catch up. And if they're trying to undermine our catching up by taking it back in prices, they're the ones we have to attack. So, you have to articulate this in a way that isn't overly defensive, but can be understood by people, and people will be sensitive to that. There is a certain left populism that can be used. So the fact that there's space, we're not dealing with a crisis of profits where we have to really think about taking things completely over or helping capital. There is space. That's a starting point. The other thing that I'd emphasize is, I think you have to be a bit careful here in the wages. I think one of the things that has to happen is organizing. It's also a time where people who are facing inflation, all of a sudden unions become very relevant. What do I do without a union if there's nothing there? I mean, this is a time to organize. And this is a time to actually cooperate in organizing. Unions should actually learn to cooperate in doing some organizing. We'll help you where you're stronger. You'll help us in the communities where we're stronger, et cetera. So organizing should be part of the strategy. The third thing is, and this links up to the larger questions, I think we have to be more sensitive to inequalities within the working class. And so, for example, with the UPS negotiations coming up next July, part-timers is going to be a big issue.
Right. That's right.
And it also relates to this two-tier thing. I mean, if I was a worker, I'd be very upset if my union is saying we just negotiated a great contract, but it doesn't apply to new workers. It undermines solidarity. You can't expect these young workers now to become the future leaders and love the union. So we have to be really conscious of inequality because it's a just demand, but it's also part of building the working class so we're stronger. If some workers do well and most workers can't, and the truth is generally, very few workers can be militant enough right now to defend themselves.
Right.
The other thing that I would raise that I think is important, and again, I'm stretching this question, but one of the things that Adolph has always emphasized in his writing is collective goods. And I think we just have to remind people about what our wage is. There's a social wage that we depend on at least as much, especially for poor people. I mean, the minimum wage is nice, but having universal health care and free education and housing you can afford, override those things in a lot of ways. So thinking in terms of collective goods is very important because the alternative is going to be, one of the ways you slow down the economy is austerity. You cut back on social spending, or you contain it at least, or you just do it symbolically and then reverse it. So I think for unions to emphasize collective goods is crucial too. So I guess what I'm saying is there are things that unions do, they should keep doing. And there's a real opportunity. Defend workers against inflation. You have to show that there's somebody behind defending you. That's absolutely important. You don't do that, forget it. You can argue for equality within the working class to show that it's not just about whoever can bargain the best as you're bargaining toughly. So, organizing, really, when workers ask for more wages, what they're saying is the distribution of income in this country stinks, and we're trying to correct it.
Right.
And we have to articulate it that way. And then I think emphasizing collective goods is very important because they're so vulnerable. These things are really vulnerable at a time that we especially need them. And if we get unemployment and they cut back on unemployment insurance, you have to start making choices between paying your health bill or paying your mortgage. I mean, these are all questions we really have to address, and they're difficult ones. So I think we have to politically try to think exactly, what's been emphasized, get into the concrete, into the trenches and fight, but also simultaneously make those struggles into struggles that are related to strengthening the working class as a class for the future and raising broader political questions, some of which are very immediate, like collective goods, and some which start raising larger questions about power and democracy.
Yeah, that's great. And I say, like most of what we've discussed so far points to the fact that inflation is also a political concern. You've both pointed out, like in your work, that since the end of World War II, the struggle between workers and employers or capital and labor has been increasingly reformulated in a technocratic way as a trade-off at the level of the national economy between concern with securing full employment versus currency stability in scare quotes of inflation. Can you explain to our listeners how and why the full employment versus inflation trade-off became so prominent, and why we might say that talk of the full employment inflation trade-off is class politics by other means?
This idea that there is a trade-off between full employment and inflation, as Adolph suggests, goes back to period around World War II. There was actually this political analyst in 1952 named Sam LaBelle, who famously said that inflation is going to be the permanent dilemma of the post-war era. And what he was pointing to is this basic tension. There's a logic to it, which is that when we have full employment, meaning everyone can have a job, anyone who's able and willing to work can find work, guaranteed employment, workers have a lot of bargaining power and they have a lot of spending power. Those two things together, right? The wages that they can win through their bargaining power and the spending that they can do through the higher wages they have can produce the kind of economic activity that drives prices upwards. So there is a potential that full employment can create inflation. The trade-off is where the class dimension comes through. It's only a trade-off if you assume that there's no other way of controlling inflation than to eliminate full employment.
Right.
And that's, kind of right back to where we are right now, right? If the only way of controlling inflation is through raising unemployment, of course, you can't have full employment because full employment is going to lead to inflation, and inflation means we have to have unemployment. We're just going to run in a circle right there. But if there's other ways to think about how we might control inflation that don't involve workers bearing the burden, but involve the capitalist class, profits bearing the burden, then maybe we could have non-inflationary, that's in scare quotes because that was a term that was used a lot in the mid-century, non-inflationary full employment. But that idea of a trade-off took root 75 years ago, and it took root because it's an easier way of explaining the problem than actually confronting the real political question that we've been talking about for the last half hour or so. And it's become deepened over the last few decades. Now the idea that we can have full employment is basically dismissed by many economic policy elites as an illusion or as a fiction that's going to come back to bite us if we try to achieve it. Something that we can't even bother trying to do because it'll necessarily yield inflation, and that inflation's got to be met with force in the form of unemployment. So you'll have economists say, well, look, I know it sounds good. I know full employment sounds good, but if we try to do it, it's actually going to hurt workers because in the end, we're going to have to slow the economy down, and the pursuit of full employment is going to just get us more unemployment. That makes sense if your presumption is that profits can't be touched.
Right.
If your
That's right.
presumption is that there's no other way to organize economic activity outside of corporate capital controlling every investment decision. But if you question that, and if you say, well, what if we did question profits? What if we did think about a different way of deploying capital through the public rather than through the private? Maybe we could achieve full employment without inflation. And this takes us back to where we started. And it sounds like we're going in circles, but that's the issue with this dilemma, right? Is that unless you break out of the confines, as Sam was saying, of the only solution is more unemployment, well, until we break out of the confines of that, I guess I should say, and start thinking about the actual and imagining a kind of political path towards an alternative economic arrangement, we're going to be stuck in these violent swings between short periods of semi-prosperity and then crushing bouts of unemployment, back and forth and back and forth. And we obviously want to get out of that, but getting out of that requires reckoning with the underlying class relationships that drive it.
Well, yeah, and it seems to me as well that, what was the beauty of turning, to be simplistic about it, turning the struggle over full employment like into this technocratic dyad, right, or the opposition, is that it conceals the fact that focusing on inflation as a technical problem takes the issue of cutting into profits as a possibility off the table completely. And once again, it depoliticizes what is fundamentally a political issue in class struggle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and when we say profits, we're really talking about private control,
right,
over the investments that affect everything about our lives, which raises a very big question of democracy. And then if you look at the 70s, it's a really interesting situation. In the 70s, the post-war boom is over, but workers refused to say we're going to lower our expectations. Why would we? This is an unequal society.
Right.
And it took them a decade. They were really trying to figure out, well, what do we do about this? We've got inflation, and they didn't want to just cause unemployment. Unemployment also hurt corporate profits. Mm-hmm. Because there's no demand for it. So they struggled for a decade. They tried to have import controls. They tried to stimulate the economy, actually. Carter and, Adolph has studied this a lot, but, they kept going through different answers, wage and price controls. And what they finally concluded at the end of the 70s is you have to smash the working class.
Right.
It's
funny how it always winds up there, doesn't it?
Yeah. As long as workers are safe because they have social programs and wages,
right,
they don't just seem to accept kind of our arguments.
Right.
And in order to crush the working class, they had to do some very dramatic things. But there's another lesson in here. And that lesson, because a lot of us romanticize the 60s and 70s, and that lesson is that if you're only militant in a capitalist system because you don't control investment, you're going to be undermined. Eventually, they're going to exhaust you with unemployment. Business Week had this line in one of their issues at the time, which I actually thought was brilliant in an evil kind of a way. They said there isn't enough room on sidewalks for picket lines and unemployment lines.
Oof.
And they got it.
Yeah.
They got it. There's a choice here. And capital at that time actually made, a fairly conscious choice that, hey, we got a crisis here. And the options are polarized. The only solution is, you can either say we're going to regulate corporations more, or we go the other way. We just say that we need more capitalism.
Right.
And that's what neoliberalism was.
Yep.
Adolph had put this in terms of, neoliberalism is capitalism without a working class opposition. And what neoliberalism was we're going to deepen capital. It didn't mean we're just deepening markets. It didn't mean less state. The whole question about it was class-based. And that's what they decided. And the fact is that unions never figured out that this wasn't temporary. They kept hoping this will change with the new administration, et cetera.
Yep.
And the problem was that as long as workers weren't fighting, they got away with this and had low inflation. Workers' expectations were broken. That's what they did. So we're in this dilemma of, for one thing, this long-term defeat is a major part of our dilemma. I mean, we should never underestimate how profound this defeat has been in terms of how people's expectations and what they think is possible. But there is a sense in which, I think, as Samir was saying, this is also a moment when there's some fight back. I need a union. My union has to be protecting me. So it's also an opportunity that we can defend. But it does require us always to be thinking about, the political has to emerge out of people's daily lives. Out of the frustrations that they have, we have to show, yes, you don't have to wait until we fix that. You can fight. But you're also going to have to think politically if you really want to win.
Yeah.
Not just moderate things. And that's kind of, a major challenge. I just want to say what winning means, because there's a way in which we can become policy wonks and make lists of good things that we would like. We can all do that. But the point that Samir was trying to get at in his last intervention was that if you don't actually change power in society and challenge private property, all those policy things can't happen, even a sympathetic government. So the policy has to extend into, what do we have to do to actually change power? Because electing any government, and again, I'm coming back to something that Adolph said a long time ago, was elections are important. We shouldn't dismiss them. But elections without a base aren't important. It's when you have a real base that elections become important. And so building the working class is the most important question. And inflation can unmake the building of the working class. It can move workers to the right, or to become more divided, or to be more resentful of those who are better off. And that's where we have to intervene.
Right. Yep.
This is really the big challenge, I think.
Well, thank you. And I think that's a perfect segue to our standard question that we put to all our guests, which is, what would the country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? So for you both, how would our working class government understand, contain, prevent, and respond to inflation?
Well, I think what this discussion, I hope, can illuminate is that inflation and the response to it raises a sort of fork in the road. There's either we win it on our terms or they win it on their terms. And that's something that I think can sometimes be hard to see with these bigger economic issues. It's something we're more familiar with in a given workplace. We know in a workplace, everything's about a struggle. It's a fight to get everything that we have, and the employer would just as well take it away. And it's a constant contest within a given workplace for everything that we have. And that principle applies at this level of politics and political economy as well, that either we fight and we transform this issue and transcend it, really, and in so doing transform the economy, or we get beat. It's one or the other. There's no real middle ground. There may be short-term, very short-term stalemates, but in the grand scheme of things, there's no middle ground. And we know what losing looks like. We've been losing for a long time, and we may lose this immediate round. And that may be higher unemployment, needless suffering, and so on, right? The stuff that we're familiar with. But we could also fight to go in the other direction, or at least try to build the power to go in the other direction. And that would involve reshaping how the economy is run, questioning the right to make a profit, questioning what capital is. Is capital something that ought to be held in private hands? Or should we think about this thing called capital like a public utility, like something that we ought to regulate and manage in a rational way in the interests of society? And that's really where this goes. So, the specific responses to inflation, as we think about it as a technical question, may involve price controls. They may involve some amount of rationing. They may involve, certain kinds of taxes or certain increases in supply, and so on, right? There's all these kind of policy wonkish, as Sam put it, ways to think about it. But the sort of the sum of all of that is rethinking how and in whose interest the entire economy is run. And that really involves questioning whether or not private economic power ought to have the right to decide what capital, which we all produce, all that capital is produced by us, what's done with it. And that's the essence of this question. And it's a big one, and it's not one that we're powerful enough to influence, but it's a long struggle. And what we can do with this issue right now is use it as an opportunity to see clearly what's at stake and to think about what we need to do to get to the point where we actually are powerful enough to influence it.
Thanks, Alec. Because these are definitely questions that we need to start asking, right?
Yeah.
Sam?
So 2 or 3 things I guess I'd emphasize. One is that, and I think Samir started with this earlier too, there were all kinds of problems we had before. I mean, if we just go back to, housing is a problem and high education costs is a problem and transportation, et cetera, we could fix inflation. We still have those problems.
Right.
So, those are things that have to be put on the agenda. But what we have to learn in terms of politics is if politics isn't changing the structure of power, if it's just a government that we're depending on to do good things, we're going to be in trouble because we'll still be dependent on them. We can win some reforms. It's worth some reforms, but they'll be very limited. So that's one thing we have to learn, that this is going to involve challenging corporate power in some way. And a government that isn't ready to do that isn't going to get very far. And I do want to say it's important to have good technical solutions because it gives you some credibility. You do have to say what you would do about housing. That's a difficult question to answer. Healthcare, there's a lot of examples, obviously, that the US could follow. But policy is relevant, but we should put it in the context of how does it affect our mobilizing? Because ultimately, if we can't organize the power to change things,
Right.
no government the governments will betray us again. And so that's what we have to think about is both what would we need? How much do we really have to challenge the corporations if we want to win those good things? And then how do we build the power to do that? And I think it's a triumvirate of those kinds of questions.
Well, brothers, thank you very much. This has been great. And this is Class Matters.
Thank you, Adolph, and thank you so much, Samir and Sam. You've been listening to the Class Matters podcast. We were joined today by Adolph Reed Jr., Sam Gindin, and Samir Sonti. Our podcast engineer is Jimmy Wirt. Subscribe to Class Matters wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you can, support us on Patreon. Head over to our website's resource page for more information on the ideas discussed on today's episode. And thank you for listening to Class Matters.